newsologist. One world, many views. Yes, some of them. So there's another debt crisis, and this time it's from one of the stalwarts, one of the faves in the race for the biggest debt implosion. It's from Italy, and the ECB is vowing to avert the debt crisis, and it's this is the ECB is the European Central Bank, the Central Bank do Euroland. So they are vowing to avert the crisis. They're lifting the rates for the first time in many years, over 10, 11 years, 12 years, and the rates that they've had have been exceptionally low. And they've raised them by 50 BPS, 50 basis points, a half of 1%. Now, this is a comparatively mega big move for the ECBs. And Lagarde, she's the head of the ECBs. She's pledging to deliver this. Yep. But after initial little bump up, the euro has fallen back, and there's been some sort of sell-off of Italian bonds, their sovereign debt, just like gilts in the UK, or just like T-bills, T-bonds, T-notes, treasuries in the US. So the ECBs, they've raised the interest rate by this 0.5%. And they're pledging. They've stood there and they've got a copy of Harry Potter, and they've all put their hands on the top, and they've pledged to use the magic of the ECB keyboard that can print infinite amounts of money, and they've pledged that to prevent the surging borrowing costs from sparking a debt crisis. As ever, Italy in the political scene tends to be staggering from crisis to crisis. Now, that's the outside view of it, and part of it is due to the Italian system of government, which is a method of proportional representation, and due to this, you obviously get completely divergent factions in the parliament, but these factions tend to have to make concords, agreements with other disparate factions to form governments, because unlike the British system of first past the post, where basically you only have to get about 35% of the population to vote for you, of the voting population that is, you need a far higher percentage. Consequently, you get left-wing and centre-ground, or right-wing and centre-ground groups having to form alliances. These alliances have, by their very nature, they're different, so they have different views on the economy, on healthcare, transportation, social things, taxation. They've got to come to some sort of concord somewhere in the middle. And this broke down last week, and it broke down with Draghi, who's the PM, Prime Minister of Italy. The different factions wanted to go different ways in regard to basically giving people money. The cost of living rises in Italy, like most of the Western world, are pretty severe, possibly not historically severe, but are severe in regards to the last 20 or 30 years of comparatively steady inflation around the 1 to 3% mark, with a target of 2%. So here we've got Italy back in the frame. They need to hold another election because the parties can't agree, and they don't want to agree. Some of the parties wanted to give money out, stimmy checks, handouts, assistance. Depends on your political standpoint as to how you would term the money. But the money has got to come from somewhere. You can call it whatever you like. You can call it a stimmy, you can call it a handout, you can call it assistance, but it don't make any difference. The money has got to be raised by either one of three methods. Either you raise taxation, or you sell debt, or you transfer money from somewhere else in your budget and you use it for the new stimmy checks. Those are the three options. In option two is you raise and sell debt. You've got two options on that. You can sell it externally to banks and insurance companies, basically anybody that wants to buy big wedges of government debt. Obviously, government debt is not collateralized. It's only collateralized by being the government with a stream of taxation in the future to pay for it. The other method in the debt is you buy the debt yourself. If you can't get an external bank to buy it, you buy it yourself. This is what the US government has done. It's what the UK government has done. It's basically what most of the countries in Europe have done. They've bought their own sovereign debt. Basically, this is short-term gain, long-term loss. You buy the debt, but it's still got to be serviced. The servicing costs tend to be low because the central banks give the profits that they make back to the government. So there's just basically the vig that the central bank takes out of it. The problem comes though is the effect of these debts bought by the government of its own debt in the future, and how you resolve them and how you get them off your books of the central bank. That's never mentioned. Basically, it's just all, how do we help the people? The people need help. How do we do it? This is what's created this. So it's the first ECB rise for a long time, more than a decade. And as ever, all these central banks, they tend to give you guidance, verbal guidance that is, to try and prompt the market. This is what we're going to do, so that the market can take it into the calculations, so the market doesn't knee-jerk when the rate change or wherever policy change happens. They try and give them a few months' notice or a few weeks' notice. Look, this is what we're going to do. I can't tell you exactly, but we're thinking along the lines of possibly it's going to be somewhere in the region of between 24 and 26 basis points. You get it? You get it? That's 25. Can't tell you exactly because it depends on the meeting, blah, 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 blah. So this was going on in the forward guidance was along the lines of 25 BP, quarter pound. And basically it came out, shock and horror, it's half a point, 50 BP. So you go, okay. In the grand scheme of things, it sounds big. In the real scheme of things, it's a gnat's anatomy. The reason for this is because inflation is eating and eroding all the savings and purchasing power, primarily across the Western countries. And it's dependent on which figure you want to use. It's somewhere in the region of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Anywhere you want to pin the tail on the donkey. If you use the CPI figures for the different one, and the Europeans have a homogeneized one, CPIH or HCPI, whichever way around they say it. You can argue whether it's 7.9 or 8.2 or 9.3 or whatever. For most people, especially people at the lower end and lower scale of income, it's disproportionate. If you're on £1 million a week and the price of a gallon of petrol, liter of petrol, or a loaf of bread goes up, you're on £1 million a week, it ain't going to make any difference to you whatsoever. It's just a little mini bump in the road. You won't even feel it. If you're on minimum wage and price of things goes up, you will feel it quite dramatically. And this is the prime sort of reason that the government has fallen. The Italian government wants to try and help the Italian people out. How you help the people out, you cannot argue about that. This is a direct payment of money out into to the people. The long-term way of helping people is by having some sort of stability in the economy and having a good economy where there is jobs that pay sufficient amounts of money that people don't need to be reliant on government subsidies or government payments. Virtually none of the Western countries have got to this stage. The large sections of the lower parts of the economy are reliant on government payments and assistances. It's the first rate rise for a long time. And obviously they give guidance, and also it's taken away the negative rates. And if you're a big bank and you deposit money with the ECBs, the deposit rate is zero. And you say, well, why are you doing that? Well, there's various banking type things where where they actually make money off of this by loaning things out, repos and all the rest of it. But that's not what the purpose of this is. It's to go through the ECB debt crisis adaptation. Lagarde, she's the president of the not of Europe. No, she's the president of the ECBS. She's the head banker. She's the bankeress in chief. And she said it was time to deliver. It's time to. It's like you ring up on your ECB app and you get a delivery time. Or card or a DoorDash. You know, this is money on wheels. Yeah. And it's time to deliver after the Eurozone inflation hit a record high. This is a vinyl record high because it's so long since it's been that high, but it's 80, it's not 80, it's 8.6% to June. Let's round things off. And I can't be bothered calling it 8.6%. Let's just call it approximately 10. It's probably higher than 8.6 and it's probably higher than 10 because the method that they use to calculate the CPI is, to lots of people's view, deficient. But anyway, no, let's use the 8.6. So we'll be talking about the same thing. And the ECB, similar to the major banks, central banks, the Federal Reserve in the US and the Banco de England, the Bank of England, all have guidance of 2%. Bank of England has tram lines, it says within 1 and 3%. The Federal Reserve has 2% over a period of time. Question, what's the period of time? Answer, we're not going to tell you so that we can fiddle the numbers to get it equivalent. And ECB, see it's not 2, it's just less than 2, but close to 2, as close as you can get to 2 without it being 2. But all these numbers might change if they kind of get inflation down. And what you'll probably find is that they start feathering it in, and maybe it should be 3%. That's if they kind of get it down. If you get a couple of years of 8%, or 7%, or you kind of get the inflation down, then you'll find that the method of calculating the CPI will be amended drastically, or the guidelines will be changed subtly. Over a number of years, it's got to be 2%. Well, it's the inflation's around 8%. Yes, but if we do it over 50 years, it averages out. You know the score. So Lagarde's got the vinyl record out, and they've got the targets to the 2%. Draghi's resigned, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be a snap election, so snap that we're going to have to wait about 2 or 3 months for it to happen. And apparently one of the big American banks, Morgan, said that Draghi had been a victim of a populist coup. Yeah, the populists, they just didn't like him. They didn't like bankers, and they got him out. So Draghi's history, maybe he's not, he could be coming back with the coup, return of Draghi, here we go again. Who knows? It's Italy, anything can happen. Obviously with that, the Italian stocks in the bonds sold off a bit, and the ECB put the rates up, and blah, blah, blah. Everybody's running around doing short-term changes to the portfolios. So the still agreeing a new bond, a bond buying program. That's to try and counter the surge in borrowing costs. This is just insanity on a stick. It's the same stuff round and round and round again. The EU was formed of a number of countries. It's in, I don't know, 27 or whatever it is at the moment. The bulk of them making up this mob or comparatively small countries. It's dominated by basically 2 big countries, Germany and France. These are the 2 countries that basically pull the strings. And they, along with the other Euro countries, did a stability pact back in the 1990s. And this was like a roadmap, a rail track of how to go from the 20 odd different countries. It wasn't 27 at the time, but whoever was in the European Union Common Market Community, whatever the term was in the 1990s, whoever was in that at the time agreed to this sort of step-by-step approach. It was promulgated by the Germans from the Bundesbank, bearing in mind that they had a reasonably good track record since new Germany was formed in the aftermath of WWII in 1945. And the Bundesbank had done pretty good at keeping inflation in check and making the German economy comparatively strong based on the interest rates and fiscal sort of prudence. The other parts of Europe, including the old people down in Roma, Milan, Vicenza,
Alert from reminders.
Firenze, Napoli, all of them, they weren't too keen on any of this. They tended to have bigger deficits. That's how much each year countries got to borrow, and bigger deficits year after year gives you bigger total debts. Debts is just the sum of all of the deficits added together, plus the interest. So basically, this roadmap, everybody signed up to it, said it was great, and it gave a couple of sort of percentages that the governments had to strive to get to. If they didn't get to them, they had to show how they were going to get to them, and if they didn't keep to these guidelines, that they would be enforced. I'm going to send round the heavies. And the guidelines were that the deficit, that's the year upon year difference between what the government raises and what it intends to spend, should be no more than 3%. So the government has an income from taxes of, say, 100, and it wants to spend 103. Well, okay, that's within 3%. Same again, but it wants to spend 9, well, that's a deficit of 9. And basically, they've got to state why and where, and is it a special case, and blah, blah, blah. But basically, they stand to be enforced by the other countries. And the big one is the debt. This is the debt to GDP. Sorry, the government deficit, I got that incorrect. It's not 3% of what they're borrowing. It's 3% of the GDP. So it depends on what your GDP is, and your deficit is 3%. So it's partly what your tax is, because obviously if you tax to 100, but it's based on two things. It's based on the deficit. The deficit number that they came up with was 3%. Now that's not 3% of what they're raising in taxes. So if the government's raising 100 and they want to spend 103, that's not how they work it out. They work it out on what the GDP is. So if the GDP is, let's say it's 1,000, then it's 3% of 1,000. So the deficit could be 30. So it's immaterial of what the government can raise in taxes. You would expect, though, that there's a relationship between how much the tax and how much the deficit needs to be. The other biggie is the debt, and the debt is supposed to be 60, no more than 60%. And if you're above 60%, the EU expected you to come up with some sort of guidelines, plan, statement. How are you going to get this down? And as long as you could show year upon year that you were reducing your debt, so if your debt was 75, that's above 60. If you could show that next year it was going to be 74 and next year it was, then basically the EU just kept out of your hair. That's it. You seem to be managing that. But if on the other hand it was 75 and it was going up, then technically the Commission and the Council of Ministers, they could come down heavy on you and sort of like sanction you and blah, blah, blah. Enough to be said that basically none of this ever happened. All the big countries, and this included the UK, when it used to be a member of the Common Market, EU, European Union, whatever the name was, their debt was, and always has been, above 60. It never got anywhere. Never got anywhere close to being that. And it's the same. Germany is above it. France is above it. They're all above it. And Italy is like way above it. Italy is like in the 150% region. In Greece, that stalwart of democracy is, theirs is I think above 200. So you say, well, how come Greece got into the euro? That's simple, isn't it? The euro's got nix all to do with economics, finance, stability, and all the rest of this stuff. It's got everything to do with political maneuverings. The politicos wanted Greece in, so one of the nice big American institutions came across to Greece, took some numbers out of one column, put them in another column, used some integrated binomial disposition and transpositions and factorials. Then the manager, and basically they just fiddled the books by putting stuff into different pots and calling it different things, and here presto, the deficit wasn't this and the debt wasn't that, and wow, Greece went from sort of finishing last in the marathon, and from marathon to Central Athens, finished last in that, and it became so super good that it was vying to be in the Olympics. But that was a load of hocus pocus. It was a load of rubbish, and as soon as it got into the euro, things started to go belly up. But the politicians all just looked the other way and let this go ahead. That's top. So the ECB is capable of going big. Lagarde has said. She's basically saying, we don't want to do this new program. She doesn't tell you what it is yet, but if we have to use it, we will. Yeah, we've got this big gun. It's a lovely gun. It's a really, really smooth gun. I've been polishing it. I don't want to take it out of the box and get it wet. I don't really want to use it. But if any of them ducks come over, I'm just going to blast them. Yeah, there you go. So Lagarde, the duck hunter. The ECB is trying to tackle inflation, but the same as the Fed and the Bank of England, it doesn't want to put the economy into recession by upping the interest rates so much that it chokes off finance to companies and destroys the economy by cutting the demand. The Western countries, US, UK, Europe, are consumer-led demand. That's what drives the economy. Consumption economies. So all the Western countries, including the EU, is being hit by energy going up, food prices going up. And obviously what's happening in Ukraine, and it's not a good situation no matter which way you want to look at it. For the people on both sides, it's not a good thing what's happening. But this is obviously constrained business activity. And the main thing though has been the reaction of the Western countries. Now, you can argue from both sides. You can argue and say the sanctions should be applied, and you can argue that sanctions shouldn't be applied, and you can argue somewhere in the middle, which says only sanctions that don't hurt yourself should be applied. Well, I think what's happened, and it's reasonably clear, is that initially the Western countries have come out with these bag of sanctions, and they've applied them nilly-willy, and they've thought that by applying these sanctions that the Ruskies would cave and that everything could go back to kind of normal pretty quickly. They've continued with increasing the bag of sanctions, but they seem to be under this misguided apprehension, understanding, philosophy that the West can apply sanctions and the Ruskies will just stand there, will drop their shorts and bend over the headmaster's desk and take it like a good little third former. Well, the Ruskies, apart from not dropping their shorts, not leaning over the headmaster's desk, they went out and decided that maybe we don't need to go to that school anymore. Maybe we can do these other things instead. The assumption that the sanctions could be applied, that they wouldn't have any effect on the people in the Western countries, but they would destroy the economy in Russia, seems to not be working out. You can argue the morals, the politics, you can argue that. What you would find it hard to argue is that the sanctions do not seem to have had any material effect on the events in Ukraine. But they're having some quite deleterious effects to the people in the West, shortage of energy, cost of energy. And you can argue, like President Biden did, that this is a price you just gotta pay. You just gotta pay. Come on, man, you just gotta pay this price for freedom or whatever it is that we're fighting for and paying for this week. Or you can argue that perhaps the sanctions were applied too broadly, and you can argue different points on that scale, but it's having a bad effect on the economies, the gas prices. This coming winter, who knows? There was big conjecture whether Nord Stream 1, the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, would restart after the annual maintenance, and it has done, but possibly it reduced flows. Whether the flow rate gets put back up to the normal rate, that remains to be seen. But the Ruskies haven't just stood there. They've decided that some of the countries are hostile countries, and hostile countries, they'll still trade with them, but you need to pay them in Russian currency, in rubles. And apart from the initial downturn, and President Biden saying, you know, the rubles went to ruble over war, well, it's strengthened, and you know, the price of oil and gas has went up, and the Ruskies are making possibly more money than they were before. So Gohar, who's the policy and central bank strategy at a US bank, Evercore, said, and here's a huge sentence here: the combination of a brewing giant stagflationary shock from weaponized Russian natural gas and a political crisis in Italy is about as close to a perfect storm as can be imagined for the ECB. Well, two things. It's a big statement. It's a big sentence. I disagree with it personally. I don't think it's anywhere near a perfect storm. I think it's a bit of a bad hair day. It's a bit of a rainy, windy weather, but it's not a perfect storm in any way. So what they're saying is a brewing giant stagflationary shock. Okay, from weaponized Russian natural gas. The Russians are saying, we'll sell you as much gas as you want, but you need to pay for it in rubles. There's the gas. If you want it, give us some rubles for it. We didn't want any more Yankee dollars. We want rubles for it. You've got two options: either pay them in rubles or not get as much gas as you were planning on getting, or you can get the gas from somewhere else. And they're trying to do that. They're trying to get it from the United States, and they're trying throughout the world to try and negotiate contracts. Problem with the contract that they're trying to negotiate with Kuwait, sorry, not Kuwait, with Qatar, which has a giant field, the North Field. It's a huge gas field. And it has wanting to do a long-term contract. It's not a simple matter of just drilling a few holes and the gas comes out and here, presto, off you go. You've got to put the installations out there. You've got to put the lines in to gather, to increase your production capacity. This is, you've got to add additional modules, additional trains to the gas processing and liquefaction plants that you've got in Qatar at the moment. And you would have to invest and build in transporting vessels to take the gas from Qatar to Europe. I suppose you could, if you were that way inclined, you could try and build a gas line from Qatar across Saudi Arabia, through Egypt, across the Mediterranean, and link it into Greece or link it into Italy. You're looking at project which will probably take 6 or 7 years and quite a few billions of dollars. So the Qatarians, they're wanting long-term commitments. Yeah, we'll give you the gas. We've got more gas, but we need to invest to get the more gas out. We're okay, happy to sell it to you, but you need to give a contract for 12 years, 15 years, 20 years. Well, the people in the EU ain't too keen on that because they've swallowed the green pill. And you can argue whether the green pill is a good pill, a bad pill, or a no pill. But they've swallowed the green pill, and the green pill says, we've got to decarbonise. And anything doing with the carbon ain't good. So we've got to get rid of the coal, we've got to get rid of the oil, we've got to get rid of the gas, we've got to have windmills and thermal and whatever. So they're a bit of a quandary. So if you sign up for the long-term contract, you're committing to using gas for the next, 10, 15, 20 years, which the EU don't want to have to be in the position. The Yankees are stuck because their exporting facilities are constrained because there was a big fire in one of their terminals. The American companies that produce gas want this to happen because they can then export the gas at a higher price to Europe than what they can sell it for in the United States. So there's a big push from them to have it. But this guy from Evercore stagflationary shock from the weaponized Russian natural gas. Well, who weaponized first? Now, you can argue about the war, the invasion, whatever you want to term it, but the weaponization, you've got to remember sanctions came in the sanctions came in response to the Russians' invasion. That's fine, okay. But the weaponization of the Russian gas, what did you expect the Ruskies were going to do? Just like I said, the EU was acted like the headmaster and said, Mr. Ruski, get yourself to the headmaster's study. Mr. Ruski said, I'm not too sure about going to the study. I think I'll just hop over this fence and off down the local shops and get myself a Russian MacD's. All of these companies that were in Russia have either been sold on or bought out, and some of the oil and gas companies like BP and Shell, people like that, have sold quite lucrative, or in the process of selling quite lucrative assets that they've got in Russia to possibly Russian firms, possibly, I don't know whether there's Chinese finance involved or Chinese firms involved. But Shaklan, which is the big oil and gas fields out in the Pacific, which basically these were islands which Russia got as part of the WW2 payoff for going to war with Japan. So those have been sold. BP and Shell have divested themselves. They've lost money on these things. They've cut themselves off from operating in Russia. You can argue about the morals of it. What you can't argue about is the effect that it will have on our profits in the future. You can say that oil and gas is on the way out, and but if oil and gas is on the way out, why short term we need the gas, blah blah blah. Russian weaponization, political crisis in Italy. Well, there's a political crisis in Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, every other week. Well, especially in Italy. It is nothing new. It's not like this wasn't known about, the deficits, the debts, the debt overhangs in these countries. It's well known about. This has just bubbled to the surface. This has just come to a head. A perfect storm. It's not my view, it's bad hair day, it's bumping the road. It's not a perfect storm. It's not going to sink the EU. The EU is not going to keel over and drown because of this. They'll do whatever it takes to keep the EU on track. They'll raise the taxes, they'll sell a debt, they'll buy their own debt, they'll twiddle fiddle the books, the P&L will be upside down, the balance sheet will be left to right. Who will suffer from it? The normal citizens in the EU will pay for it, of course they will. But it's not a perfect storm. Don't think so. The ECB's been slower than the other central banks to respond to inflation, lags behind the United States private bank, the Federal Reserve, then lags behind the government-sponsored owned Bank of England, which they've been putting the rates up, and the Fed's expected to put them up another 75 basis points in a few weeks' time. Euro rose, and then it sort of lost again. Then we've got lad Brzezinski. He's from the Cloggy Bank, Dutch Bank, ING. Investors are absorbing the likelihood of the ECB's raising the rates less than we expected in the future after it weakened its guidance from before by shifting to a meeting-by-meeting approach to interest rate decision. Well, this is what they do anyway. There's no change here. This is always the case. Investors are always absorbing likelihood of rate changes. Basically, he's saying it's susceptible to more rate rises in the future, and it's going to be done on a meeting-by-meeting. To me, that's nothing. That's what happens anyway. The guard at the press conference said the discussions with the bank within the bank, that's the ECB bank, had focused on tackling inflation. She didn't focus on tackling it last month, the month before. She hasn't focused on tackling it for the last year. Now they've focused on it because it's a big inflation running down the streets. A big elephant. It's a big bull elephant knocking Dutch windmills over as it goes down the street. Tackling inflation with a bolder rate rise while designing a bond buy-in scheme. This is the magic keyboard, the bond buy-in scheme. This will be financed with the magic keyboard, which when you type on it, you just create as much money as you want. To prevent the Eurozone spreads from widening. This is the spreads. Each of the sovereign countries within the EU sort of combo, has its own debt, and it issues the bonds, although it issues them in the same currency, euros. The rates that they pay are different. Get that, yeah? So if the Dutch people issue a bond, they get 1%. If the Germans issue it, they get a different percentage. If the Italians issue it, they get another percentage. The Italian one normally pays a higher interest rate than the German one. And this has been known for a long time, and the EU had hoped that over the years that these rates would get closer and closer together to basically add unity, but they haven't. And in fact, in some cases, they went further apart. The perception is that the Italian bonds are risky, i.e. the chance of you being paid back is less than if you get the German bond. So there's basically a credit, AAA, AA, B, BBB, blah, 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 between the credit view of the Germans and the Italians. The Italian having a lower junk bond rating compared with the German high-classy investment grade. This is something that the Europeans need to resolve. They've needed to resolve it, but they haven't resolved it. They've had 20-odd years to get this in hand, and to date, they haven't resolved it. Will it ever be resolved? Don't know. It's politics. You need to... the problem is that if you bung them all in, and we all have, so that you buy your bond from the ECB, which would be one way around it, i.e. the ECB issues bonds. So the ECB issues bonds on behalf of all of the other countries. So the ECB bond rate is, say it's 1%. So if you want an ECB bond, you go to the ECB and you buy that. The German government then buys the bond off the ECB. French government buys the bond off of it. So they're all buying it at the same rate. Don't know. The size of the bond purchases under the new programme had no limitation. So Lagarde, she's saying, no, there's no limitations. There's no limitations primarily because they don't know the ramifications of it. They don't know the intricacies of the bond system and who owes the debt to who and when and where and how the collateralizations are going. She also doesn't want to put a figure on it in case that she has to spend more than that figure. So she says €1 trillion. So they end up spending €1 trillion and they say, well, you spent €1 trillion, what are you going to do now? So she doesn't want to cul-de-sac herself. She doesn't want to put herself into a corner. But what she's also said was she doesn't want them Eurozone spreads from widening for unwarranted reasons. Unwarranted. If you haven't got a warrant, you can't have a reason. If you haven't got a reason, you can't have a warrant. So basically, she's saying unwarranted reasons. It's whatever you want unwarranted to me. It's just nonsense. It's politician type speak. Unwarranted reasons. Maybe there's a definition in the ECB handbook what unwarranted reasons are. I don't know. There you go. I've got my warrant. I've got my reason. There you go. You haven't got your reason, you haven't got your warrant, so you can't change it. The political turmoil in Rome, open brackets, is nothing new, close brackets, has raised concerns that the rise in interest rates will affect the sustainability of Italy's debt, sovereign debt, which is around about 150% of the GDP. So that's if everybody in Italy, Fiat, all that production, Alfa Romeo, all that production, Ferrari, all of that production, all the pasta, all the pomodoro, all the prosciutto, everything that Italy produces, man and boy, woman and girl, night and day after day, 18 months, all of that, if you added it all up, would just balance out the debt. So how are you going to pay that debt off? Well, obviously inflation. You're never going to pay it off. It's impossible to pay it off unless you stop increasing the debt. They've got no intention of doing that. Italian debt's 9% deficit this year. Italian debt sold off, surprise, surprise. The yield on the 10-year bond jumped up 0.25% to 3.7%. 10-year bond, which is like a medium long-term bond, 10-year bond, guaranteed 3.7% return. That's not bad. Apart from the fact that inflation's 8 point whatever or 9%, let's round them off. Call it 9%, call that 4%. You're still losing 5% purchasing power. But where else are you going to put your money? Put it in the market. Yeah, the markets went down this last 6 months. Will it go down any further? Don't know. Will it go back up? Don't know. Will the companies that pay dividends, will they still be able to pay them? Don't know. Will they be higher? Will they be lower? Will inflation keep going at 10%, 8%, 5%, 4%? Nobody knows. This is all conjecture, and you're looking into the future. But the expectation is that the GDP is going to fall over the next year or so. So if the GDP falls, but the amount of borrowing is at the same level, then the percentage is going to be higher as a percentage of GDP, because one of your calculations, one of your numbers has changed. So it's going to affect your outcome. Will it bring down the EU? No, nothing. Well, it would have to be an absolutely horrendous thing for the EU to implode and stop. None of this is going to do that. All these people that come on and say, this is the end of the EU, the debt's going to do this. Because the people that run the EU are all signed up long-term politicians. They all have the EU as basically their religion. That's what they believe in. And facts, finances and inflation, none of that has any effect on what they're going to do. They will bolster, they will print, they'll impose taxes, they'll change things, but they will not give up this European state. It's just not going to happen. So will it be a bit bumpy? Yeah, I think so. It'll be a bit bumpy. They'll come up with some newfangled, convoluted way of sorting out what they're going to do. The maybe's, I've seen this reported, that they'll basically, the EU, ECB has on its books bonds from various of the member countries, and what they're saying is they would sell the German bonds, like the high-grade bonds, and they would use that money to buy Italian junk bonds to maintain the spread, to stop the spread from getting too much. Difficult. In my mind, it certainly won't be resolved this time, and I would doubt whether it will ever be resolved. Certainly not in the foreseeable future. There's too many vested interests in keeping it as a shambles and keeping the things misaligned. The banks are making horrendous amounts of money out of it. They like the spreads. It means that they can do different plays. They can hedge, and they can do all of this with the different bonds. You can only do that if you've got something which is different, something which is a variance between one spread and another. I didn't want just one currency, one rate, one method to make money. This, the short, you buy German, and the short Italian, or do the reverse. So that's it. That's what's happening in the land of the ECBs. So arrivederci. Ciao. Time to put the kettle on.